we'll start with three homage to the Buddha every time. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody. Now, does everybody have the sheet on the infant origination that we handed out last week? Everybody has it? Okay, so now we've been studying Sutta number 38 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is the greater discourse on the destruction of craving. And so far we did the section on consciousness on page 351. Okay, so just the point in this section is that the Buddha is arguing or contending that consciousness is always conditioned, that consciousness always arises in dependence on conditions. If you remember the way the sutta originates was when a certain monk by the name of Sati starts spreading around his understanding of the Dharma, which is that he's saying that according to the Buddha, it is the same consciousness which travels around from life to life. And then, in other words, he's taking consciousness to be a kind of self or soul that moves on from one life to the next. And the Buddha says that Sati has failed to understand that consciousness is always conditioned, that there's no kind of permanent, self-existent consciousness which just goes on retaining its identity throughout one life after another life after another life. But even from moment to moment, consciousness is always different, always arising, dependent on the appropriate conditions. So we have through the eye, we have eye consciousness, which sees forms. Through the ear, hearing consciousness, which hears sounds. Through the nose, nose consciousness, which smells odors. Through the tongue, tongue consciousness, which tastes flavors. Through the body, body consciousness, which experiences bodily sensations. And through the mind, mental consciousness, which cognizes ideas. Okay, so in this way we see how from moment to moment consciousness is conditioned. Okay, now we move on to the next section in the sutta, which is called, it deals with the 4 kinds of nutriments. Now we're on page 352. Okay, so now the Buddha asks the monks, he says, do you see this has come to be? It's a very compressed, very concise statement, and it doesn't quite indicate clearly what is meant by this. But it seems that the monks understood what the Buddha was driving at, and they realized that what is meant by this is the entire compound of what we call the 5 aggregates. So what constitutes the living being, the person, actually turns out to be these 5 factors, 5 groups of factors that we call the 5 aggregates. What are the 5 aggregates? Anybody hear of them before?
Form, feeling, perception, volitional activities or fabrications, consciousness.
Right. Okay, so there's material form, feeling, perception, volitional activities or formations, and consciousness. Okay, so now the Buddha is asking, he's going to be showing now in this passage the conditionality of all the 5 aggregates. In the previous passage, he was showing how consciousness is conditioned. So he asks the monks, do you see this, that is, this person made of the 5 aggregates, has come to be? And then they say, yes, Venerable Sir. And he says, do you see its origination occurs with that as nutriment? That is, it's referring to the specific factors that function as the nutriment for the 5 aggregates. Now in English, we use the word nutriment with the meaning, what is the usual meaning of nutriment? You know, a common word?
Food.
Right, food. So in Pali, the word is ahara. The word is ahara, which it comes from a verb aharati. And the verb aharati means, usually it means to bring. So somehow the noun ahara, which comes to mean food or nutriment, has implied in it the sense of bringing. Maybe that which brings up, or maybe that which sustains, we could say. So maybe sustenance would be the idea behind nutriment. So that which sustains and nourishes the 5 aggregates is what is called nutriment. And so the 5 aggregates originate with nutriment as its condition. And according to the Buddha's teachings, there are 4 kinds of nutriments. We've gone through this earlier, but it doesn't hurt to go through it again. So what are the 4 kinds of nutriments? I thought you raised your hand.
No.
Yes.
Can I answer in Chinese?
Yeah, you can say in Chinese.
抽斷食. That is.
You're speaking Cantonese. No.
Okay, your Mandarin is better than mine.
Okay, you can speak Cantonese. No, nobody can translate Cantonese. You can?
Well, I know what he's going to say.
Okay, try it. Try it in Cantonese.
粗團食, 粥食, 見思食, 識食.
Can see it.
是是是。
I know Shesha, yeah. Maybe you better translate.
What's the second one you said? The third one you said 意识是。
粥食.
What is 粥?
touch.
Or choose.
Yeah, I know what Chusha is, but I can't recognize the Cantonese. Okay, let's put them into English. Okay, one is just, we call it solid food. Second is contact. Third is mental volition. And the fourth is consciousness. And each of these is a nutriment. The word nutriment is being used in the sense of a strong supporting condition, or that which sustains or nourishes something within the five aggregates. And so solid food, material food, is the nutriment for the physical body. The body, if we don't eat at least a few times a day, then the body starts to get thin. And if we don't eat at all, then the body just withers away. Okay, the second nutriment is contact. This means contact between the sense faculty, an object, and the mind or consciousness. And so contact is the strong condition for feeling. So it's dependent upon contact that feeling occurs. In fact, contact is really the condition for feeling, perception, and volitional activities. They all depend on contact. But of those three, usually feeling is selected as the special result of contact, because feeling is what conditions craving. And then when craving gets activated, craving is what drives the round of birth and death, or samsara. Okay, then mental volition is actually karma. And so through our volitional activities, we constantly are creating karma. And then the karma that we create becomes a strong condition. And what is this karma the special condition for? Yeah, it's the special condition for the particular mode in which rebirth takes place. And so we could say that the mental volition becomes the sustenance for the rebirth consciousness. So what is it that nourishes the rebirth consciousness? Sort of what is it that feeds into the arising of the rebirth consciousness? It's the volitional activities. And so through our volitions or our karma, the rebirth consciousness arises. And that rebirth consciousness, even though it's just like one moment of consciousness, but it inherits or it receives the entire flow of karma, of karmas that have been created in our previous lives. So all of those karmas, with all of their tendencies, just get directed into that rebirth consciousness. It's a little bit like opening up the floodgates to a dam, and then all of the water that's been backed up in the dam comes flowing, down the falls, and then down into the lower part of the river. Okay, then consciousness is also a nutriment. And so what is consciousness a nutriment for? Yeah, what we call, in Pali we speak about this as name and form, or it's the whole complex of the bodily and mental factors apart from consciousness. So if there's no consciousness, then our body is just like a log. It's just a dead body. So there's no life, there's no functioning, no operation in the body. So all of the vitality in the body depends on the presence of consciousness. And then if there's no consciousness, can there be any feeling? No. If there's no consciousness, can there be perception? No. If there's no consciousness, can there be any kind of volitional activities, plans, purposes, intentions, desires? No. So all of this depends on consciousness. So then we could say that karma brings the re-arising, it nourishes the arising of consciousness, then consciousness nourishes the entire process of body and mind. So everything develops in dependence on consciousness. But consciousness, in turn, depends on other things. Consciousness, in turn, depends upon the body in our own experience. If there's no body, do we have, maybe some of you have experience of disembodied consciousness, but normally consciousness is embodied. And then whenever there's consciousness, consciousness also has to function through feeling, perception, and volition. Without feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness can't remain on its own. Okay, so this is the way these four nutriments nourish this entire complex of the five aggregates. Okay, so now the Buddha says, do you see, now we're coming back to the sutta, do you see its origination occurs with particular types of nutriment? So the monks say yes. Then the Buddha asks, do you see with the cessation of that nutriment, what has come to be is subject to cessation. So in other words, in order for the cessation of the five aggregates to take place, one has to stop the nourishing of the five aggregates. This doesn't mean, though, that in order to end the five aggregates, one stops eating and starves oneself to death. That was the practice that the Jains would undertake, at least some of the Jain ascetics, since they had the belief that the ideal was to subject oneself to the most extreme type of ascetic practices. And the most extreme one was to starve oneself to death. But for the Buddha, what has to be done to stop this process of nutriment is to end craving, which is, in a sense, the underlying cause of the whole process of nutriment. Okay, the rest of these sections that we have here, I'm not going to go into them in any detail, but the Buddha just is questioning the monks to make sure that they have no doubt about this, that they have seen this for themselves with proper wisdom. Until we come to paragraph 14, which is, again, it's a very important, very incisive paragraph. So it's easy to overlook. But here the Buddha says, purified and bright as this view is, if you adhere to it, cherish it, treasure it, and treat it as a possession. The Pali word here is mamayati, which means literally to make it mine. Then would you understand that the Dharma has been taught as similar to a raft? That is, it is for the purpose of crossing over, not for the purpose of grasping. And so this is referring back to a sutta that we had studied earlier, which was the sutta on the simile of the water snake, where the Buddha uses the simile of the raft to illustrate the function of the teaching. In that simile, he says that it's like a man who comes to a body of water and he wants to cross over. And so in order to get across, he builds a raft using his own hands. Then he crosses over the body of water, gets to the other side, and then what does he do with the raft? If he understands the purpose of a raft.
Lets it go.
What is that?
He lets it go.
He lets it go, yeah. So the raft is just an instrument for getting across to the other shore. And so the Buddha says in the same way, the Dharma should be seen as like a raft. It's for going across, not for clinging. Not to have something to cling to. So here, the Buddha in this sutta, he's speaking specifically about this view. We call this view of wisdom that one uses in order to understand things as they really are, to let go of them, to break through attachment through false views and craving. And so if people just take up the view and cling to the view, then they're not understanding the Dharma correctly. And this is quite common in, I have to say, in Buddhist countries, at least from my limited experience. People have developed views about the Dharma, and then they hold, this is my view, this is the right view, your view is wrong view, your view is wrong view, and then they start arguing about one another's views. And this has gone on in Buddhist history through the centuries. But for the Buddha, the purpose of the right view is not to build up a kind of system of ideas, a system of thought, but to have an instrument for understanding things correctly. And then one uses that right understanding in order to cut through one's ignorance and grasping. And then once one cuts through the grasping, then one doesn't grasp to the view itself. So of course, when teaching, one will teach in accordance with that view in order to impart correct understanding to others. Okay, now we come to a passage in the sutta where the Buddha is going to connect the teaching on the 4 types of nutriment to the teaching of dependent origination. Actually, the teaching on the 4 nutriments is already dependent origination. Basically, what the teaching on the nutriments is showing is that whatever arises through particular conditions. So about a week ago, somebody wrote to me. He said, when one explains dependent origination, is it necessary to explain it in terms of the 12 factors in the classical formula? He said, is it possible to explain it in 10 factors or 9 factors? And I wrote back to him and I said, if one really understands dependent origination correctly, one could reduce it simply to maybe 3 factors. ignorance gives rise to craving. Craving gives rise to the five aggregates. That's the essence of dependent origination. But if one wants to specify how craving gives rise to the five aggregates, then one brings in from craving to grasping or clinging to karmic formations. And if one wants to explain how from the five aggregates one gets back to craving, then one brings out from the five aggregates the six sense bases, contact, and feeling. And so the expanded 12-factor version of dependent origination can be compressed into these three factors: ignorance, craving, the five aggregates. And ignorance and craving, where are they to be found? Where?
I was going to say everywhere.
Craving part of ownership.
Okay. Ignorance, craving, the five aggregates. Where are ignorance and craving to be found? It's a trick question.
Five aggregates.
Yeah. Ignorance and craving are within the five aggregates, but they are that part of the five aggregates that sort of comes out and then creates a new set of the five aggregates. And then in that new set of the five aggregates, there's ignorance and craving. They come out and create another set of the five aggregates. And so when one understands this, then one could see how the Buddha can say samsara is without a first point, without a beginning. Because wherever there are the five aggregates, there was ignorance and craving before them. And wherever there was ignorance and craving, there were the five aggregates, which were due to previous ignorance and craving, which were in five aggregates that were due to previous ignorance and craving. And so it goes on without any first point. Okay, so now coming to paragraph 15, the Buddha says that there are these four kinds of nutriment for the maintenance of beings that have already come to be, and for the support of those about to come to be. So what are the four? I already went through them. Nutriment of physical food is nutriment, contact, mental volition, and consciousness. Okay, then the question comes, what is the source, what is the origin for the four kinds of nutriment? Okay, then the texts tell us these four kinds of nutriment have craving as their source, craving as their origin. They are born and produced from craving. Okay, this is something that seems a little bit puzzling, because usually we think, why is there craving? You know, if you pass through a food stall, and in one food stall they're making pizza, another food stall they're making what do they make? Some sweet things like ice cream for sale. Another one they have candy and chocolates. Another food stall they have maybe fresh bread. And then you start smelling the different kinds of food. And then it creates a craving for food. And then if you can't resist the craving, then you go to one of the food stalls and start eating. So it seems that craving is the origin of food. And if we don't have craving for Italian food, maybe this is a way to explain how craving becomes the origin of nutriment. Okay, people have a craving for Italian food, so then some Italian people come to the neighborhood and they open up an Italian restaurant. Then people start going to the Italian restaurant. We like the Italian food, but it gets boring after a while. Too bad we don't have a French restaurant here. And they start talking, and then some French people hear, they want a French restaurant in that neighborhood. So then they come and they open a French restaurant. And then there's French food available. Then some people think, we need an ice cream parlor in this neighborhood. Where can we get a decent ice cream? So then somebody gets the idea, some young entrepreneurs get the idea, people say they want ice cream, so let's open up an ice cream parlor. So maybe we could say in this way, craving is the origin of nutriment. Okay, but normally I think of nutriment as being the origin of craving. But I think the way to understand how craving becomes the origin of nutriment is to think that it is craving that turns edible food contact, mental volitional activities, and consciousness into things that nourish other things. So whether one has craving or not, one has to eat. It's one of the conditions of life is to take in food. But it is through craving that food turns into something that nourishes further craving. That sort of, the food takes on a different significance. It becomes not something simply to sustain and support life, but the food becomes an object of enjoyment, an object of indulgence. And so the food will then trigger off a kind of craving for this taste, this flavor, that flavor. Okay, similarly, as long as we live, we make contact with objects, and contact will give rise to feeling. This is the case whether it's an arahant or an ordinary person. But it is through craving that there comes a kind of thirst for certain types of contact. The contact that will give rise to pleasant feelings, the feelings that will gratify that craving. And so it's the craving that gives the contact a special significance, so that our world becomes organized into pleasant contacts, unpleasant contacts, desirable contacts, disagreeable contacts. Okay, then it's craving that turns mental volition into a nutriment or a nourishment of the life process. As long as we're alive, we're always engaging in activities, and so there's always mental volitional activity going on. But it is the craving that makes that mental volition turn into karma. So it's through craving that we have volition to acquire those things we consider desirable. Through craving that we try to avoid those things we consider undesirable. So craving becomes the condition for this whole bundle of different types of mental activity driven by greed and by hatred or aversion. And then whether there's craving or not, as long as we're alive, there's consciousness. We're always aware of something through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind. But it is craving that gives a particular direction to consciousness. So it's craving that makes us direct consciousness in such a way that we become aware of those things that will satisfy our craving, and so that we can avoid those things that are repugnant to ourselves, so that we can avoid those things that we dislike. Okay, so in this way we can say that these four kinds of nutriment have craving as their source, craving as their origin. Whether there's craving or not, those four kinds of nutriments are always functioning. As long as we live, we have to eat, we make contact with objects, we engage in different activities, and we are conscious or aware. But it is craving that turns these four activities into things that nourish the process of becoming, the process of samsara. Okay, now the Buddha raises the question, where does craving arise? Craving arises from feeling, feeling arises from contact, contact from the six sense bases, the six sense bases from name and form, or mentality, materiality, materiality from mentality, materiality from consciousness, consciousness from the volitional formations, formations from ignorance. So through craving, now the Buddha has connected the teaching on the four nutriments to dependent origination. And then in paragraph 17, he goes into dependent origination in forward order. He takes the 12 factors in forward order. And then in paragraph 18, he takes dependent origination, the 12 factors, in backwards order. And so I prefer to explain dependent origination to take it in backwards order. And I've done this in detail with some earlier suttas, but now I'm just going to treat it briefly so that we can get an overall picture of how these 12 factors hang together. Okay, so first, the last factor in the formula is old age and death. So this is you could say that this is the central problem of suffering that the Buddha faced when he went on his quest for enlightenment. How do we put an end to old age and death? And then the Buddha, as he investigated, he realized that old age and death occurs. Usually we think, why does, if you get a death certificate, the coroner has to fill out a form, and the form will say, cause of death. So, heart disease, maybe in medical terms, coronary thrombosis, or stroke, cancer, automobile accident, pneumonia. But if the coroner were a good Buddhist, cause of death, birth. Essential cause of death, birth. Incidental cause of death, that could be the cancer, heart disease, stroke, whatever. But the reason why anybody has to die, because they are born. Okay, so then he raises the question, what is the condition for birth? And then he uses an expression that's a little bit hard to understand. The expression, birth is the condition for old age and death. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But then the question comes, what is the condition for birth? Why are we born into this world? Okay, so the statement that comes in the sutta is bhava paccaya jati, which means birth. Jati means birth, and cause or condition is paccaya, and the condition is bhava. Bhava is what is translated here as being, sometimes as existence, sometimes becoming. And so if we just see this statement, it's a little bit puzzling. What is meant by saying that being or existence is the condition for birth? It seems, to common sense, it seems that birth is the condition for existence. Okay, to understand what is meant by bhava, being or existence, the commentators explain two kinds of existence. One is called kama bhava, which means, I translate this as karmically active existence. And the other is upapatti bhava, which means rebirth existence. And so, the relationship between these two is that karmically active or karmically creative existence is what creates rebirth existence. And it is rebirth existence, upapatti bhava, is actually identical with jati. But kama bhava, that is the side of existence, the side of life in which we are creating new karma, fresh karma. And so, if you pay careful attention to your experience, you could see that sometimes in our day-to-day experience, we are just sort of floating along nonchalantly, just experiencing things in the world. But then at other times, we are acting upon the world. And when we are acting in ways that are ethically or morally either positive or negative, then we are creating karma. And that is what is called kama bhava. Those occasions in our lives when we are actively creating fresh karma, new karma. And so this new karma can be unwholesome karma or wholesome karma. For example, when one practices generosity or helpfulness to others, one is creating wholesome karma. When one observes the precepts, one is creating wholesome karma. If one practices meditation, one is creating wholesome karma. If one studies the Dharma with an aim to understand, one is creating wholesome karma. If one explains Dharma to others, one is creating wholesome karma. If one does anything from the motivation of generosity, of loving kindness, of compassion, helpfulness to others, one is creating wholesome karma. But if one harms others, steals, acts in any way out of greed, hatred, and ignorance, then one is creating unwholesome karma. And so this wholesome karma and unwholesome karma we are constantly creating, and that karma becomes accumulated within the deep layers of the mind. And then this karma is what becomes active at the time of death, and that karma gives rise or creates the new birth, the next birth. And so it's our karmic activities that direct the stream of consciousness to the new existence. Or in other words, it's karma, karmically active, karmically creative existence that determines birth. Okay, maybe we'll pause here and I'll ask whether there's any questions on anything that I've been saying so far before we come to the next. What did you say? Oh. Okay, 2 comments. The Chinese translation of the 4 nutriments is actually quite similar to the English. For solid food, the Chinese word means chunks or separate servings. Excuse me?
You mean in Chinese?
That's what this person says, yeah. Duan, yeah, duansha. The duan is a lump, right?
It's a period time. Each period time like...
Oh, I see, the duan is a period of time.
Lunch and dinner.
Because the Pali, it's kapali karo aharo. Kapali means a lump or a ball. In Chinese, this would be, I think, kwai. Kwai.
Actually, it's literally identical meaning. They lump it together. That's how Indian eat. Lump it together, the small ball.
Yeah.
2 different translations. She's saying one, he's saying.
Yeah, maybe Tuan is the common translation. I don't know what the old translators use.
Both are common.
Both are common. Okay. Then another comment is taking craving to be demand and nutriment as being supply. Okay, that's good.
Can you say that again? What is supply?
He says craving is, in economics, supply and demand. And they say that demand creates supply.
Oh, his case.
So he says craving is demand, and it's the origin of nutriment, which is supply. I don't know. And then the question, what is it that grasps onto consciousness as a nutriment? It's actually the other 4 aggregates that take up consciousness. Okay, any questions? Please.
One thing I'm kind of grappling with is the notion of rebirth. Am I to understand? Is it accurate to conceive of like rebirth from moment to moment, from one moment to moment, as kind of a microcosm of rebirth from life to life? Is that?
One could say it as a kind of microcosm, but I don't think it would not be really correct the way some do to interpret rebirth to mean just, the arising of experience from one moment to another. But as you say, we could see it as kind of microcosm. But according to the Buddha's teachings, that there is a rebirth, which is a continuation of the life process through the flowing on of the stream of consciousness from one physical body to another physical body. But as I explained last week, what the Buddha rejects is the thesis that it's the same consciousness as a kind of persisting self that continues on. Consciousness is always changing, always arising and passing away. But the stream of consciousness doesn't come to a complete end with the death of the body, but it will go on to new forms after the body expires. Yeah.
Jati, that's birth, not rebirth, correct?
Jati just means birth.
Yeah, so they're not really talking about rebirth, they're talking about birth, what causes birth here, not rebirth. Right?
Yeah, but birth is always understood as a rebirth, but the word jati itself simply means birth.
I mean, does the Buddha in the Sutta Pitaka ever use a word for rebirth, or is he just speaking of birth whenever he gets into it?
Well, I think birth is, sometimes we have the expression punajati. Punajati, puna means